So, welcome. We're here today with Lee Carroll on another podcast, another episode of Mason's Medicinals for Real Mushrooms. And Lee is a medical herbalist, and he's got over 30 years of experience in both the educational side of things and the clinical aspect of things, both combined. So, he really helps educate, and he has been educating healthcare practitioners for quite some time on how to use herbal medicines in a safe, appropriate, and effective way. He also has a private clinical practice where he likes to focus on making things personalized, practical, and science based for his patients. And I'm looking forward to talking more about this, but Lee also has a new medicinal mushroom course coming out at the end of this year, if I'm correct. And I'm sure that Lee will give us an intro to that. And anyways, welcome, Lee. We're really lucky to have you, and we're looking forward to chatting with you today.
Thanks, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not really looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So, I kind of gave a little bit of your resume there, but is there anything else in your personal background that kind of got you started into this world of things? Just like the first sort of tidbit on, you moving in towards the path of herbs, wellness.
Everybody has their own unique story. I think it was cannabis that got me interested in the plant world. And like many, young adults, I'd had a reasonably challenging upbringing. And I think I got stoned properly for the first time when I was 19. And that really opened my eyes to the potential of the world and the universe in general, but also to the power of plant medicine. And from there, I went and studied a botany degree. I fell in love with plants so much. I thought I'd go and, study the natural world. And that didn't lead into any meaningful employment for me. And then I ended up working in retail bakery, and hot bread, we used to call it in Australia, was very popular back then. And I paid my way through college by working as a baker. And then when I finished, that company offered me a management position. And after about 6 or 7 years of night shift and eating all of that awful, processed food, I became quite unwell. I ended up with insulin resistance, and the doctor said, "Lee, you better get your act together." And so that was about age 30. So that's when I really focused on the medicine side, and I started at MediHerb as the first production manager in 1990. So that's 1990 is really the first time, where I took that professional step. But I'd been using herbal medicines, obviously not well enough in the years leading up to that endeavor. So since then, it's been, my life has been, totally built around herbal medicine. I've moved my family around the world to do that. And I'm at 62, I'm practicing what I preach, and I'm still loving it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I can definitely hear it in your voice and the way you talk about things. That definitely comes through. So what about herbs? You worked for MediHerb, which is this awesome herbal medicine company out of Australia. What are you most attracted to in the whole herbal medicine world? Is it helping people? Is it the plants themselves? Is it kind of growing the plants? What about herbal medicine really shines through for you?
That's a great question. And my answer to that question's evolved over time. And, my current position is that whether we're thinking about life spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, in any way, we're intimately involved in a deep conversation with nature, and we just can't avoid that. And the modern world and the influences of the modern world seem to me to be trying to create a disconnection between the modern human and the natural world for the purpose of, annual growth, for the purpose of improving, the capitalistic model, if you want to just, use a term for that. So my interest in herbal medicine comes from the point of view that when we consume a plant, we don't just consume the nutritional elements of that plant. It's not just the carbohydrate, the proteins, the minerals, the enzymes, etc. The secondary metabolites, the phytochemicals that don't necessarily play a role in the plant's, daily life, but they allow that plant to survive in the environment where it lives. So I'm talking the colors, the flavors, the aromas of these plants that allow them to influence animal behavior so seeds can be dispersed, the way that plants can protect themselves against UV light or outcompete other organisms in the soil. So these secondary metabolites, of which there's a vast number, they don't play a nutritional role in the body, but they play a regulatory role that our cellular, being actually needs to maintain optimal health and homeostatic balance. So, the catechin polymers from green tea, they can get into the bloodstream, they can interact with the endothelial cells, they can moderate the behavior of the glycocalyx, which manages the health of those endothelial cells. So if you drink green tea on a regular basis, you'll have less cardiovascular disease, for example. So there's a story to tell with every herb, and often there's multiple chapters in that story. And the modern human is not just starved of good quality nutrition, they're starved of good quality, phytochemical input from the diversity of foods that we no longer eat. So I think that for every, Rudolf Steiner said that for every disease, there's a plant in the world that's a cure. So, in the modern setting, all of the things that ail modern man, there's lifestyle and, plant-based solutions that, can significantly help people. And, the modern system is all about resolving symptoms. The modern patient is impatient and they want quick results. So, modern medicine is very seductive to people. It gets them hooked in. So I like to see myself as a keeper of the tradition. I come out of a long tradition of herbalists. Kerry Bone, who was the founder of MediHerb and arguably the most significant influence over me herbally, far exceeding anything that I learned, when I went and did my herbal medicine degree, that, he's driven to ensure that herbal medicine as a tradition survives. And it's not just about being commercially successful. I'm imbued with that same kind of passion. And I guess that's why, I've become so obsessed with, the idea of teaching and spreading the word, because it's very hard to change a large number of people just by having a small clinic, in some small city somewhere in the world. Having a presence on the education stage allows me to support, patients all around the world.
The intermingling of everything you're talking about there, from the medical model to the chemistry in plants and the energetics of plants, and just the whole disconnect that we're all experiencing to some degree with nature. So thank you. Really appreciate your answer. I wonder, when you kind of had your more of your shift when you were in your 30s, like you were saying, were there specific plants or specific health routines that really helped you get on track, or was it more of just like an awareness piece? Take me through that if you don't mind sharing.
For me, the journey to good health was a real struggle around improving my diet and, getting back into a good exercise routine. So for a number of years, I really struggled with, the urges to eat sweet stuff and all that sort of thing. I very quickly got into a good exercise routine and started swimming on a regular basis and mountain bike riding. But the herbs that really, in the early days, really helped me were licorice root, echinacea root. MediHerb makes the best echinacea in the world. If you're not using MediHerb's echinacea, you've not got the right stuff. And Korean ginseng. So those three herbs were my first entry into my journey to health. And I still have a very fond spot for those herbs. Licorice is underrated as a therapy. It's quite tasty, obviously, but I see it as a low dose herb. I never use that much in a formula or products that I use. I don't go for high doses of licorice. Korean ginseng is misunderstood. It has huge benefits for both men and women, and as a daily tonic, it is excellent for all aspects of health. And echinacea is a regulator of the endocannabinoid system in the body. And the endocannabinoid system is a homeostatic balancing system which controls the nervous system, the immune system, and the gastrointestinal system. But it's present in all systems of the body. But in the nervous system and the immune system, it's a key player. And the regulation of the endocannabinoid system within the populations of all of the cells keep the immune system balanced and allow it to respond to threats appropriately. Echinacea optimizes natural killer cell numbers and it improves processes of phagocytosis. So I've been a daily consumer of echinacea for nearly 30 years now. In animal studies with echinacea, if they have echinacea their whole life, they get a lot less cancer, for example. I can't get every patient to take echinacea on a daily basis, but I'm a living example of how beneficial to your health it can be. So from those three herbs, it's now expanded, obviously, and 32 years later, I take handfuls of herbs every day and drink cupfuls of mushroom tea every day, and don't restrict myself. If I feel like it, I'll go for it. But the list now is really quite long.
Nice. What's on the top of the list these days, other than the mushrooms, in terms of herbs?
As you get older, sometimes sleep can become a bit challenging. So at every stage of life, there's lessons to learn. So I've learned that I can't eat anything sweet after 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Even a piece of chocolate's enough to affect my sleep. So I don't get enough deep sleep. So I'm on lemon balm and ziziphus and ashwagandha, some valerian to help manage that, which is doing a good job. I still take the Korean ginseng daily. I do a little bit of green tea daily, a little bit of milk thistle daily, ginkgo, grapeseed, because they're all things that look after our general health. And if you could turn it into a food, it'd be the sort of healthy snack that you'd eat, to maintain optimal performance. I do bioavailable turmeric every day. I think that's a highly significant thing that every person could get value from. There's all different forms and different understandings around how to do that. Some fish oil, a good blend of multivitamins and minerals. You never know what you're missing. So topping up the tank with a low dose across the spectrum is a good idea, I think. But yeah, the list just keeps on going on, Mason.
Let me in on what you're doing right now. It sounds like it's working for you, so I'm happy. I know like you said, you like to, really incorporate a lot of stuff into your diet, but in terms of your own applications with herbs, what are your favorite ways to consume them? You said you like some tea, a little bit of tinctures. I know you like the extracts too, or is it just a little bit of everything?
It's a little bit of everything. You're actually in my clinic now, so the bottles that you see on the wall there are the MediHerb liquids that I use. Mostly the MediHerb liquids. MediHerb doesn't make all of the herbs that I want to use, so there are some other companies there. So every patient that I see gets a liquid formula that's individualized for them. And then on top of that, they get tablets as required and dried herbs as required. So the most common dried herb that I recommend is slippery elm. So I buy that, by the kilogram and dispense that for the patients. But I also work with a range of teas. So rooibos tea is a great alternative if people don't like green tea. So I make up a spicy blend that patients can add to their rooibos tea with mandarin peel, chen pea, and a tiny bit of licorice and cardamom and cinnamon and some dried ginger, for example. The tea side of it is the smallest component, of my clinical practice. And then I try and get people to eat as much medicinal food as possible. So on my website, I've got a couple of recipes for making what I call a flatbread, which incorporates various medicinal herbs and mushrooms. So things like rosemary and nigella, turmeric, cumin, mustard seeds, shiitake mushrooms and maitake mushrooms. When they're powdered up and cooked into a flatbread, they're quite tasty as well. So I'm always trying to, come up with some crafty way for a patient to, to get the medicine in. If they're making a salad, people will often want to use parsley as a garnish, or mint or dill. I'm advocating that rather than put like a pinch, they put like a whole handful into, to get the medicinal benefit of that.
Yeah, I've been following you on Instagram now, and yeah, you're making some pretty tasty stuff. So keep it up. It looks good.
My Instagram feed looks like I'm a therapeutic chef, but that's just how I live my life, and it's the easiest thing for me to let people in on.
All right. Well, those flatbreads sound pretty good. Why don't we transition to mushrooms now, considering you just gave us a great recipe idea. So, how'd you get into medicinal mushrooms? What is the through line there from, working with herbs and then coming into medicinal mushrooms?
Yeah, it's an interesting trajectory. So I finished up after 30 years with MediHerb at the beginning of 2020, and I started consulting with a small company in Northern California called Third Planet, and they wanted to, create some products. And Don Lawson, the colleague that I was working with there, was really interested in mushrooms. He said, Lee, there's this company called Namex. They're the best mushroom supplier in North America. Let's start creating some blends of mushrooms and herbs. And I really got on board with that. So in early 2000, I started developing products for that company. And that's where my passion really started. In the previous 30 years, I hadn't really given mushrooms a huge amount of attention. I would use shiitake and reishi in combination to help patients with immune issues and to help patients that were undergoing, cancer treatments and that sort of thing. But I hadn't really explored the full breadth and depth. So in that year, I did some education for that company. I did a full day seminar. COVID kind of restricted, my ability to do that sort of thing. Since then, it's become a real passion for me. In Australia, I'm using a company called Superfeast, which is a powdered mushroom, which is reasonably good quality. I've become a huge convert, and now, as much as possible, everybody's getting a combination of herbs and mushrooms. In North America, it's much easier for a patient to eat a medicinal mushroom. In Australia, we're a little bit lagging behind the trend of cultivating, some of the more interesting, medicinal and edible mushrooms like lion's mane, for example. It's impossible to buy that, at a market at the moment, where you can go to a Whole Foods market in North America and quite easily pick up, a whole bunch of interesting things.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky here. We got some good growers and cultivators. So when you started to dive in, and you said you're consulting for Third Planet and doing some product development stuff, and then doing some more education stuff, and then COVID happened. What did you learn about mushrooms? What did you uncover? What was the kind of tipping point for you to kind of learn more about them?
Yeah, the tipping point came when I was buried in scientific papers, and I was reading away, trying to get my head around, how mushrooms exerted their influences. So obviously the polysaccharides play a very important role, and polysaccharides are a very complex range of molecular structures, and there's different lengths, different branching, different types of connections with those branches. And I was doing all this reading, and I started coming across this concept called trained innate immunity. And for me, that was kind of like the aha moment where everything changed, and I all of a sudden felt like I had this really deep insight into how mushrooms, supported human health. So since then, I've had lots of other discoveries, but like ergotheanine is a fascinating, entry point into the magic of mushrooms as well. But trained innate immunity, if you'd like me to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, please. Let's go into trained innate immunity, please.
Yeah. So the idea that the innate immune system doesn't have a memory has been challenged by this new concept, and it was only discovered, relatively recently, and it's only been fully accepted in the scientific community just in the last few years. So in essence, the polysaccharides, the ones that are effective in mushrooms, aren't soluble, so they've got to get into the body somehow. So there's a number of theories on that. I tend to think that the polysaccharides get absorbed through the Peyer's patches, so the lymphatic tissue in the small intestine. The M cells, their job is to do antigen sampling, so they're constantly tasting and sampling all of the stuff that's passing through the small intestine. So the polysaccharides get taken up, they get passed over to the immune cells that are underlying those M cells, so macrophages, and there's quite highly specialized cells of the T and B type. There's also dendritic cells. The polysaccharides get taken up by these cells and then they get trafficked around in the body. So a dendritic cell is going to move around in the lymphatic system. You know, a monocyte or a macrophage might move around in the bloodstream, for example. And these big polysaccharides, when they're inside those cells, they start to get digested. And there's some good evidence to back this up. They get digested, and then the cells then that digesting those polysaccharides start to excrete smaller chunks of the polysaccharide, which are now soluble. So those polysaccharides can have effects then at distant locations. The modern trend to ferment mushrooms and use them as a medicine, I think the modern human mind will be like, well, if that's how it works in real life, maybe I can shortcut that and just give the body the soluble ones to start with. But those logical ways of thinking don't always translate. And the unique mechanism of delivery that I've just explained wouldn't be replicated necessarily by a fermented product. So imagine then that you've got these polysaccharides arriving at myeloid stem cells in your bone marrow, and you've got those cells coming under the influence of those soluble polysaccharides. So the polysaccharides via the dectin-1 receptor can affect the Krebs cycle in those cells. Very complicated. I don't even understand it fully. Like the protein to protein interactions that bring about all of this stuff. So the Krebs cycle gets affected, and that affects the way that the epigenetics gets expressed in those stem cells. The epigenetic expression is the crucial part. It doesn't necessarily matter what genes you have, it's what things get turned on. So in the inflammatory part of the genes, not every gene is fully expressed. Some genes may be dormant. That may be beneficial to our health from an immune point of view. So trained innate immunity is about allowing those stem cells to more fully express their inflammatory gene network, and then that gets passed on to the progeny of those stem cells. So those cells that are then born from that stem cell go out into the world with an upregulated aspect of their inflammatory network, so they're more capable of dealing with immunological challenges. There are other things that go on as well. The trained innate immunity changes the expression of cholesterol in microdomains in the cell walls of the immune cells, which facilitates more enhanced and more effective communication. And there's subtle changes in the way that cholesterol gets metabolized within cells as well. So some of the cholesterol lowering benefits that we see come from that trained innate immunity. For me, that was like the big aha moment. I thought, wow, there's really a lot more here. This is just new science. What is there that we don't fully know? So that started me reading a whole lot more stuff. So this concept of trained innate immunity means that you can, if you take mushrooms on a regular basis, say you took mushrooms at a therapeutic dose, for 2 weeks, you could stop and you'd still have the benefit of that enhanced immunological effect over, depends on the mushrooms, and the science is not very clear, but in mouse models, you can, with maitake, you can get benefits up to 28 days later. So it probably depends on the mushroom, it probably depends on the loading doses, but what it really translates to in practice is that patients aren't very compliant. If you're a bit intermittent with your mushroom use, it doesn't really matter from that immunological point of view, as long as you're getting a significant enough dose on a regular basis. Maybe from an immune point of view, maybe 4 times a week or 3 times a week, if someone wants to reduce their cost, can give them those benefits. If we wanted to go on with that discussion, what now emerges is that there are many cells that aren't necessarily of those immune lineages. So basically any stem cell, any cell that can regenerate itself, any cell that has got the ability to deliver immunological messages. So, an epithelial cell, not an immune cell, but it might have the capacity to signal the immune system to say, hey, like there's some danger lurking here, I need some help. It seems like this trained innate immunity is a very broad spread function that mushrooms have got the ability to do. And I think that's in part what drives the tonic action that we generally see in mushrooms. So if we think about the ability of cells, to be better at what they do, so this trained innate immunity is only looked at that aspect of cell function. There may be other aspects of epigenetics that get improved as well that aren't yet being, explored scientifically. So we could look from our traditional lens, our traditional perspective, and say, what are the originators of these medicines? Let's go back and look at the history. How did they view them? What did they see, in terms of patients' health, and then try and join those dots together? I think that mushrooms are working as whole body tonics because of their ability to do this throughout the body, and particularly do it through populations of resident tissue macrophages. An important aspect of health is maintaining, a healthy status of the tissue. So with tissue macrophages, you don't want them overly excited. They should only be operating, when there's tissue damage or where there's some sort of, infective threat. So mushrooms serve the purpose of keeping those resident cells calm. So if they're overly excited and there's damage going on, the mushrooms can calm it down. But equally, it'll make those cells more vigilant and more capable of dealing with the stresses and strains. But there's a lot about that immunological tissue world that we don't really fully understand. But that for me now, this idea of trained innate immunity kind of takes the lid off the capacity for mushrooms to exert these really broad-based health benefits that go beyond just in immunological health. So I'm now a big fan. Everybody should be eating mushrooms on a regular basis. There's not really any doubt about it in my mind.
Yeah, no doubt. That's a real good intro into this new emerging concept of trained innate immunity. So with the trained innate immunity theory, or just basically how these mechanisms are working with mushrooms, is that the unsoluble polysaccharides come in contact with, we think, the lymphatic tissue in our guts. Certain cells within there, immune or lymphatic cells, then take these bigger polysaccharides, break them down into something more transferable or usable, and then those get kind of shuttled into our different organs, different systems in our body, and mainly the stem cells or the myeloid stem cells, like you said. And then that creates some sort of expression, which then creates the progenitor cells to be able to be released. And some of those progenitor cells, just people who have a more basic understanding of immunology, what are some of those like progenitor cells? Is that like white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, or is that more like the natural killer cells, macrophages, things like that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's all of them. It's monocytes, macrophages, it's natural killer cells, it's neutrophils. There's a lot of cells that aren't very well understood. So there's innate lymphoid cells, gamma delta T cells, mast cells, basophils, eosinophils. It also translates into bone and cartilage and fat and muscle. So part of the benefit of mushrooms, regularly, is improved bone health, for example. The skin gets involved, gastric and mucous membranes, fibroblastic cells, which are crucial to looking after the health of connective tissue in the body, the endothelial cells in the linings of the blood vessels, even the glial cells in the brain that keep the brain healthy. That list that I was just, quoting is speculation around the current research. So it's pretty cutting edge stuff. Some of those cells, may be proven down the track, not to be involved, but likely there's going to be other ones that we discover. Once you get your head around it, it really opens your eyes to the fact that mushrooms can actually look after your whole body as a genuine whole body tonic, in the way that, the Chinese traditional medicine described it, in the way that, Western herbal medicine describes, like improving the tone, the vigor, and the function of the whole body. Mushrooms may support the tone, the vigor, and function of various parts of the body as well. And I think that a clever strategy is to eat a broad range of mushrooms and take a broad range and medicine as well.
Yeah, to get a lot of those effects, just to kind of widen that whole approach out.
Yeah.
Speaking from sort of the contrary to that, I guess, if you were to be talking to a patient or someone who's just kind of new to medicinal mushrooms and wanting to kind of jump into this world a little bit, are there different mushrooms that you would recommend starting out with? And I know that you said that they all kind of have different beta-glucans based on their weight, their shape, their size. Yeah, is there ones that you recommend people start with? How do those more minute differences in their chemistry really impact the body?
Big question, that one.
I threw a
Cover all
couple
the different
questions at
mushrooms.
you. I think it was three in one.
Yeah.
So,
So if someone's not familiar with irregular consumption of mushrooms, the first port of call is just from a dietary point of view, getting people to eat just simple culinary mushrooms. So, the Agaricus bisporus is, the place for people to start. So the button mushroom or the portobello represents the easiest financial entry point, and there's some significantly good medicine in those button mushrooms. The next place I go is shiitake mushrooms. So they're easily available. They can be quite expensive if you buy them fresh, but I buy them fresh and dry. Organic dried shiitake mushrooms are easily available, and that allows them to be easily, introduced into cooking. They're the two mushrooms that I start with when I'm getting people on board. And then from there, depending on what's going on with the patient, we might go cordyceps, we might go shiitake. We might go reishi, or we might go chaga, lion's mane, tremella, poria, the list becomes really, quite long. Take that a little bit further with the button mushroom. There's this molecule in button mushrooms, also it's quite high in shiitake as well, called ergothioneine. And ergothioneine is in the plant world, but it's much more highly expressed in mushrooms. So, the button mushroom and the shiitake, it's like maybe 40 times higher the dose that you could get from the plant world. It gets taken up and it gets used in endogenous antioxidants. And some animal studies suggest that it's more powerful than human glutathione in terms of its ability to deal with peroxynitrite radicals and singlet oxygen radicals. It seems to have this ability to get preferentially taken up into areas in the body that are more stressed, where it plays a role in supporting the body against that stress. When you consume button mushrooms on a regular basis, you're getting, significant doses of this really crucial molecule. And there was a paper published in 2019, and it looked at a Swiss population, and it looked at their diet, and then it followed those people for 21 years, and it did biological assessments of their blood, and it was looking at metabolites of various substances in their blood, and they correlated like 1,000 metabolites across these 3,000 people. They were looking at the metabolites in the blood that most correlated to improvements in cardiovascular disease, reductions in stroke and dementia, etc. The number one thing that came out of this study was ergothioneine. It represented the most significant reduction in cardiovascular and dementia risk. And the probability on it was 0.002. It's an unheralded ingredient, like in a modern diet. We've talked about the importance of the polysaccharides. Ergothioneine, is right up there with, importance. If we're focused on taking our resveratrol and our alpha lipoic acid and the citrus bioflavonoids and all of that groovy stuff, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater if we're not thinking about, mushrooms providing that like significant level of benefit.
Yeah, I think that ergothioneine is definitely going to be a one to watch and one to take.
Yeah,
obviously.
definitely.
I've heard, I don't know if you've heard this too, but unlike, glutathione, unlike even vitamin C, is that ergo is very stable compared to some of these other antioxidants. Have you heard that as well, that it's got good
Yeah, I have read that. Yeah, yeah. Whether it's got good stability when it's delivered as an individual molecule, or whether it's important to have it as part of the mushroom complex, but certainly when it's delivered as a separate thing as part of a mushroom matrix, it is definitely bioavailable, gets into the body. The modern human likes their fads, so there may be an ergothioneine fad, which would be great, but the sensibility of it tells me we should be eating a broad range of all of these things. We should be picking out the foods and the mushrooms that deliver the most significant benefit. And if we want to be economical with the way that we choose our foods and get the best value for our dollar, then button and shiitake mushrooms need to be a regular feature of the meal, along with green tea, along with blueberries, along with dark chocolate, along with increased spices in your diet like turmeric and ginger and cinnamon. The modern human, they're quite deficient in this stuff.
It's easy to get kind of lost in all the trends and whatnot, but yeah, coming back to those very essential powerhouse things that are very, very close to their natural form, there's definitely a lot to be said about that. So
Yeah.
and you kind of circling that back, which seems to be a skill of yours. Okay, we've talked about polysaccharides. We've talked about this new concept of trained innate immunity. I know you also talk about how this trained innate immunity might have something to do with the endocannabinoid system. Can you elaborate further on how, if there's interaction there, or if it's different? And like you said before, like we know that some things are interacting with that ECS, like cannabis for one, and then some more herbal things lesser known like echinacea. So what's the connection here between the endocannabinoid system?
It's also a tough question. It's hard to explain these things that are, quite highly complex. But within the immune system, there's the endocannabinoid system is a series of receptors. So it's, CB1 and CB2 receptors. There's a whole bunch of other ones as well, TRPV, and the list is quite long, really. And then there's a whole bunch of molecules that can interact with those receptors. And then there's a whole bunch of molecules, proteins that traffic those things around and make it all work and degrade the agonist, to decrease their effect. So when we're interacting between these two concepts of mushrooms and the endocannabinoid system is designed to keep the immune system running harmoniously and smoothly. Where there's a normal level of danger present, the endocannabinoid system increases its expression of CB receptors on the surface of the cells, and it increases the production of endocannabinoids. And typically the thinking behind the process, the wisdom behind the process is to try and keep things calm and to allow the immune system to do its job of removing or infected cells or, getting rid of, any sort of invading pathogen without the immune system going too crazy. So if there's too much danger, the endocannabinoid system withdraws its CB receptors from the surface, and that allows the immune system to run much hotter and faster and deal with more of a threat. When that happens, you're then exposed to the potential of autoimmune diseases and tissue damage and all that sort of stuff. So the balances are very delicate. That's where the echinacea comes in that we talked about earlier, by maintaining that. So mushrooms play a role, I believe, because they help to maintain the immune system in a more calm and controlled and collected state. So the polysaccharides that we're talking about interact with pattern recognition receptors on the surfaces of these cells. So there's a whole bunch of toll-like receptors on the surface. There's some toll-like receptors inside the cells. And there's dectin-1, which seems to be a main receptor for fungal polysaccharides, but there's CR3 and LAC-SIR. There's a whole bunch of them. So the complex interaction of the fungal polysaccharides at these receptors, I believe, plays a team role along with the immune cells to allow the endocannabinoid system to maintain, a more optimal and harmonious balance, and to prevent things from getting out of control as much as they could in the absence of the mushroom. So I don't think that the mushrooms are necessarily interacting with, CB1 and CB2 receptors. You can't dissect out and look at these things as, single kind of systems where there's very complex interactions. So this is why, scientists call mushrooms immune stimulants. They also call echinacea an immune stimulant purely because of the mechanisms that are seen in vitro studies. But when you put them in the human body, they don't just, mindlessly, wildly stimulate your immune system so it whips it up into a frenzy and you can make autoimmune diseases worse and make cancer worse. And, it just doesn't work like that, right? So I think mushrooms is it's like delivering computer software, into your body, and it allows your body to read that code and go, oh, I can relax, I can be calm, I can be much more responsive and vigilant. So I think they work together like a hand in a glove.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, just the way you described it in terms of the immune physiology, and then pairing that with what we know the mushrooms are doing. And then, like you said, there's so many unknowns there that we still don't know, but we do know that our bodies are intelligent. These plants and mushrooms have their own level of intelligence. So the whole cohesion with that seems like a good recipe.
I used to say that, echinacea was essential on a daily basis. If you could afford to take one thing, like, that's a really important thing to take. Well, I'm now saying that exact same thing about mushrooms. They're that important. You should be taking them, as often as you can. And, they're fundamental to your good health and the prevention of, all of the awful things that happen in your life. And when you're younger, patients think that they're invincible. Not until they get, into their 50s and 60s that they realize, oh, I've got some health challenges. The earlier that you get on board with these things, the healthier you can be in your older age, for sure.
Yeah, that goes a long way for sure. Talking about just like the endocannabinoid system clinically, are you ever like, hey, this patient needs some support in this area? And what does it look like? Is it like, do they get sick a lot? Are they have some mood stuff? What's it like? Do you ever look at it that way and just being like, oh yeah, this system needs help?
If your endocannabinoid system's, not optimal, then you're going to get sick more often. The sickness won't resolve as easily as it might in another patient. And there's a greater chance of having more mood disturbance in a patient. But the most common presentation of it is, frequency of infections. Pretty hard thing to nail though, because it's active everywhere in the body. It's very adaptive. So it only shows up in the immune system when it's almost broken. The herbs that I use to fix that, I talked about echinacea, but astragalus, andrographis in acute situations, they're the key ones. And there's a big overlap between the polysaccharides in astragalus and what's going on in the mushrooms. I think that those two things combined provide a lot of benefit as well.
Yeah, there seems to be a real nice synergy there between those two, especially astragalus and some of these mushrooms. That synergy, and then also maybe synergy with any plants that amplify the endocannabinoid system. Are there any other things you like to pair with mushrooms to make them work better, per se? I don't like to use that term, but yeah, better synergies with mushrooms other than the ones we just talked about?
There's lots, actually. I'm still grappling with, the complexity of it. Let's just talk about a few of those, ideas that I'm playing out in clinic at the moment. The prebiotic potential of mushrooms is being, actively studied at the moment. The early work was pretty inconclusive, but, the more recent work on some of the more specialized mushrooms, so Poria and Tremella and lion's mane, for example, tells us that there's a really interesting and complex role for mushrooms as prebiotics. In the modern condition, non-alcoholic fatty liver is an epidemic. At least 30% of the US population have some form of metabolic syndrome. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and metabolic syndrome, are entry points into all of the modern disease categories that are, reducing the health of the adult population in the Western world. So things that we can do to help that are really obviously important. And an indirect way of helping that, this also can involve the endocannabinoid system, which might give you a better appreciation of, some of the other places where it might work. So the constant flow of rubbish, to just use the colloquial term, in the portal blood into the liver significantly stirs up all of the tissues in the liver. So the stellate cells and the Kupffer cells and, the hepatocytes aren't happy. Typically, there's too much nutrients flowing in. Typically, the blood's a little bit less oxygenated than it should be because of all the food that's being processed. That begins to affect the behavior and the health of the hepatocytes. So they hang on to more fats, they produce more uric acid, adenosine gets produced as a byproduct of all of this. That's what makes people sleepy during the day. The herbal medicine treatment works well in that particular situation, is to employ some medicine that's going to have an antiseptic effect. So berberine works particularly well in that scenario. That starts to slow down then the lipopolysaccharide component of that portal blood that takes a bit of the immunological pressure off the liver. Milk thistle makes the berberine more biologically active. Berberine's not very absorbed. It doesn't get through the layers of the large intestine. It gets seen as toxic, the alkaloid berberine, so it gets pumped back out through an efflux pump. So milk thistle blocks those pumps to allow more of it to get back in. So you've got the systemic circulation of the berberine, which then starts to affect the health of the cells in the body. So it has an effect on AMPK and improving energy balance and that sort of thing. So the milk thistle also supports the healthy functioning of the liver. When the liver's in an inflamed state, it upregulates its cannabinoid receptors, because that then signals that there's danger present, and that then activates the immune system. So you've got a much more active immune system in the liver. And if that goes uncontrolled, you can then start to get fibrosis and you to go down that irreversible track of the liver disease process. I'm now adding, there's a whole bunch of other herbs as well. There's nigella and cinnamon and green tea and that would also be beneficial. But I'm now actively adding poria, tremella, lion's mane, along with my regular prebiotics like gum arabic and slippery elm, because those mushrooms now have been shown to have significant influence over improving the growth of the healthy microflora, and the metabolites and the polysaccharides from those mushrooms actually, travel in the blood. And I don't understand the mechanism. Some of these polysaccharides that we're talking about may in fact be soluble. Those mushrooms that I've been mentioning, there's just almost an endless list of complexity in the way that those polysaccharides get expressed. They seem to have these unique ability to improve the way the liver functions and help to resolve those types of conditions. So I'm now actively using those mushrooms in that type of condition with really quite good outcomes. On another track, Tremella has got traditional knowledge around its ability to improve skin quality. So I'm actively combining it in my protocols for skin and healing and recovery from damage. So Gotu Kola is my Centella asiatica is my go-to herb in that category. So Tremella and Gotu Kola work particularly well together. Cordyceps is an obvious one. I'm using that as a whole body tonic. So I use that in partnership with rhodiola and ginseng and, those tonic and adaptogenic types of herbs. So that's a little insight. I've got these long lists of ideas that I've been working on.
These cases are interesting. Yeah, if you can dig more of those up or whatever you had in mind, that would be good. But yeah, it's nice to hear how you're putting these into play, thinking of multiple systems. And yeah, it's just amazing how complex these are, and complex but simple, like they're very simple medicines with a very high therapeutic index, but they have such a broad effect. So I appreciate just hearing your clinical reasoning behind some of the liver health and the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's fascinating.
The nervous system is obviously an interesting point. Lion's mane is really popular at the moment as a nootropic, and as the brain food. But I think that Tremella is possibly underrated in that respect as well. I'm now always combining Tremella with lion's mane in formulas for people that have got cognitive challenges particularly, and as generalized support, because there's obviously a very strong gut-brain connection that's now quite well established. So those two mushrooms key ones for me in managing dysbiosis, and it's not a coincidence that they both have got, really good benefits in terms of cognitive function as well. And some of those polysaccharides have been, they're now scientists are actively thinking that they are getting across the blood-brain barrier, and they are actually interacting with glial cells. And the inflamed brain, is a very modern, syndrome, and it's quite hard to get glial cells to reduce their level of inflammation. I use fish oils and highly bioavailable turmeric, as my main process for doing that. But I'm now actively thinking that those two mushrooms in particular will help play a role in calming that down. The research shows that under the influence of various polysaccharides, macrophages can change their activating state back to a more resting, restorative state. So it's quite plausible that that's going on in the brain as well.
Yeah, it's great to hear that these things can possibly cross that barrier. And yeah, like the lion's mane traditionally too used very, very sequentially or as a stomach tonic. So it's great to see, like you said, some of these things really coming around to blend sort of that traditional way of knowing with this more advanced immunology, or I say advanced, but the science that we're now discovering things with. So yeah, but Tremella's been an underrated one for brain stuff, I think, and I think it is good for the skin. But yeah, there is a good study out there on, it actually showed gray matter changes in some of those areas in the brain, which was pretty cool. With a short.
Yeah, it is cool.
Yeah.
On a low dose too. It was only 1,200 milligrams a day.
Yeah, it's not a lot.
So, if you've got a 1-in-1 extract in a capsule, you could have 500 milligrams. So to do 3 of those capsules, that's really easy for people to do. Yeah, it's a lot. It's an incredibly low dose, actually. I just made a few notes on Tremella because I knew I'd forget to say it. But when you look at the animal research and combine it with the human research, I'm seeing Tremella now as neuroprotective, promoting neurogenesis. So there's various parts of the brain that have the ability to regrow. Mostly that's in the hippocampus, but also myelin restoration are the 3 key things for me that pop up in the research. I mentioned dementia, but I didn't mention Alzheimer's disease. I haven't got any Alzheimer's patients at the moment, but it would be a new addition into an Alzheimer's protocol for me, particularly a prevention program.
Good things to know about Tremella. I've also, I don't know if you've seen this, but I saw some things on like an enteric coated Tremella that they use in Asia quite a bit. And I think it was for gastritis secondary to chemo or something. I'll try to dig those up and put them in the show notes. And
yeah,
I saw some stuff around.
Yeah, I have
enteric coated.
I have seen those studies. Yeah, I've seen them, and it puzzled me why they would do that. My only thought was that they wanted to deliver the polysaccharide without them being diluted, like further down in the gastrointestinal tract.
Yeah.
But maybe there's some highly specific thing that I'm not clued into yet in terms of how the gastric acid alters, the behavior of some of those polysaccharides.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at those more. What about, Lee, do you ever use mushrooms in acute infections? Do you ever throw them into your treatment protocols for acute, whether that's like a respiratory tract infection or any kind of infection?
I do, yeah. I would use oyster mushroom, but it's not a listed medicine in Australia, unfortunately. How bizarre is that? So I get people to eat oyster mushroom. My main rationale for using a mushroom in an acute infection is that it's only acute, it's not going to last forever. So, if a patient's sick for a week, when they emerge from that sickness, we want to make sure that, their underlying health, particularly their underlying immune system, is in good shape, and they'll re-emerge from that period of illness in really good shape. So I'm kind of using them like a tonic. My main go-to is cordyceps in that particular situation because, most of these infections are respiratory based, and cordyceps, I think, has got a natural affinity for the immunological tissue in the lung. oyster mushrooms and shiitake are possibly the most immunologically active in terms of prevention. But in terms of treatment, I'm using the mushroom in a very holistic kind of paradigm. And my go-to in acute infections will be andrographis, holy basil, ginger, licorice, echinacea, sometimes other diaphoretics like lime leaves and stuff. But those ones I just mentioned, they're the main ones, and I hit it really hard. But I add the holy basil's in there because holy basil oil is antibacterial. So if there's any bacterial after effects, then that helps. But holy basil is a fantastic adaptogen, antioxidant, stress protector. And being acutely ill is very stressful. So you need medicine that helps deal with that stress. So I'm putting the cordyceps in there to ensure that when that patient, comes through that period of illness, all of the immunology in their lungs will be fully restored to its optimal health, and they won't be devitalized as a result of that. If you put a healthy 25-year-old man or woman to bed for a week and didn't allow them out of bed, all I could do was read books and watch television and listen to music, go to the toilet, then about 300 pathways get downregulated that relate to their energy metabolism. The body's very adaptive. So if you're not using it, you're going to lose it. So if you're really unwell and you change your habits, you become sedentary, you spend a lot of time lying down recovering, it's really harsh on that cellular machinery that drives our energy. Adaptogenic herbs are an underrated and often thought to be contraindicated aspect of being acutely ill. And I would use Siberian ginseng in that same way. But cordyceps for me now has become my go-to. It performs, quite reliably in those conditions. And I use up to about 3 grams a day of the dried mushroom. Cordyceps militaris is the one that I'm using at the moment.
That seems to be one that a lot of clinicians are using these days with the availability and the potency and the cordyceps content in it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that cordyceps have a natural affinity to the lungs, and I know in Chinese medicine they think it works on the lungs and the kidney systems. Are there any other mushrooms that you feel have like a tissue affinity? I know I've seen a lot of research on maitake, I think, with like the bladder and prostate. Reishi, we kind of think a lot of people are gravitating towards the heart for different reasons, either traditionally or more modernly. But yeah, what about other tissue affinities you've noticed in clinic or anything you've come across?
I'm still teasing out those ideas, Mason, but obviously lion's mane and tremella for nervous system tissue in the brain, tremella for the skin, Felinus and for the liver. Those highly specific affinities, just grappling with that. You mentioned reishi and the heart. One of the affinities that mushrooms will have, particularly with reishi, is not the polysaccharides, but the terpenes. So the triterpenes, the bitter molecules, the ganoderic acids. Bitter taste is received in the mouth. You can also receive it in the airways. If you breathe in something bitter, you can taste it at the back of your throat. And from an evolutionary point of view, bitterness protects babies against accidental poisoning. So if they're out in the yard and they put, foxglove flower in their mouth, it'll taste bitter, they'll spit it back out, they won't poison themselves. That's kind of the evolutionary story. And as we age, through adolescence and in early adulthood, those bitter receptors get pruned. So when we arrive as an adult, we have less of them. And so we still have that evolutionary memory of it being toxic. So the job of our parents and our grandparents to teach us that bitterness is an important act of the food eating process, and we should become accustomed to it. Well, we now know, and this, for me, this research cycle started in early 2011, maybe early 2010. Bitter receptors are expressed everywhere in the body, not just in the mouth. So they're in the airways. So some herbs that look after smooth muscle relaxation are actually doing it via bitter receptors on smooth muscles. And there's now inhalers that actually work on those mechanisms. Bitter receptors are expressed on immunological tissue, and they play a pattern recognition role. So if an immune cell receives a bitter signal, it's a message that there's bacteria present. So they're highly expressed in sinuses, for example, and they control the production of mucus and the beat frequency, remove the mucus and the organisms, and they control the production of nitric oxide, etc. But so they're expressed everywhere in the body. Testes have got bitter receptors for fertility reasons that we don't fully understand. But if you block those receptors in animals, they become infertile. So there's lots of really interesting stuff going on in that space. But from a basic herbal medicine perspective, bitterness drives the small intestine and the stomach and the digestion and disposition of the nutrients that we eat. So bitter receptors are expressed throughout enteroendocrine cells in the small intestine and large intestine. So bitterness in terms of herbal medicine plays a very important role in digestion, sugar metabolism, all that sort of stuff. So coming back to reishi, the ganaderic acids are very bitter. So a good marker of quality in reishi is how bitter is it. And the more bitter it is, the better that bitterness aspect is going to be. But the research on how bitters work in the body is very scanty. There's hardly any of it. Not one scientist has ever looked at the effect of those ganaderic acids at these bitter receptors in the body. So bitter receptors are expressed on the heart, they're expressed on the thyroid, and it's a big black hole scientifically. So it's quite possible that reishi exerts its manifold and magical benefits, not just through this modern understanding of how polysaccharides can work through trained innate immunity, but it may also be currently unexplored mechanisms where those ganaderic acids are interacting with bitter receptors in places in the body. I've got a lot of respect for the bitter mushrooms, so chaga fits into that category as well. And there's a lot of stuff going on in chaga, that we don't know about, but chaga gets pigeonholed as for, gastrointestinal inflammatory diseases and psoriasis and then the immunological stuff. It's going to be fascinating watching that research unfold if it does. The way that money gets distributed for natural products research is a bit uneven. If I was controlling the money, there'd be a lot more research on that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we'd be having a lot of mushroom studies between you and I.
Yeah, we would.
That's great. Yeah, fascinating about the bitters. Yeah, oftentimes I am always telling people to get more bitters in their life because, yeah, it's just one of those tastes and sort of currencies of food and herbs that we don't get a lot of. So thanks for diving into the importance and the widespread location of them. Yeah, like you said, thyroid, vessels, uterus, testes. It's fascinating just to dive into that. I know gentian's a great herb for that, and I saw one study on it and peripheral vascular resistance, which is pretty neat to see how that changes the vessel integrity and strength with bitter consumption.
And if you take bitterness before a explosive sporting event, so say if you're running a 100-meter sprint or you're doing powerlifting, the research shows that if you get something really bitter immediately before, we're talking like really, like within minutes, it increases your explosive strength because it must turn on some fight or flight thing that allows you access to those, deeper energy reserves.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll have to put reishi and chaga in our pre-workouts or our pre-surf drinks.
Yeah. Well, that reminded me another interesting thing with bitterness is that if you get something bitter before a meal, and this research has been done with, some single molecules that are bitter, but if you get bitterness before a meal, you'll eat 15% less calories in that meal. So if you're allowed to unrestricted eating and you give a large number of people something bitter and a placebo that isn't bitter, the people that have had the bitter just naturally have a decrease in what they eat because the feedback mechanisms of satiety and fullness and adequacy are turned on by that bitterness mechanism. So in clinic, I use gentian and wormwood and feverfew. If you combine those three bitter herbs together, you get as much coverage as possible with simple herbal medicines that are available. I actively get people to drink reishi as part of that bitter kind of concept, and I explain what I've just explained to you in simpler terms. to get people switched on to how important that stuff is, because it's very hard to get bitterness in the modern diet. There's very few foods that deliver enough bitterness to give us the medicinal properties, because we've bred all of the bitter molecules out of the plants that we consume, mostly because we're babies and we don't like the bitter taste. Oh, it tastes bitter. I don't like it.
Yeah, the bitter
Give me
truth.
something sweet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm glad we touched on bitters. I didn't think we are going to go there, but I forgot all about them. So thanks for bringing up the bitters and the triterpene.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Drink more reishi tea.
Yeah, that's great. So we've been through a lot. We talked about the different sort of mechanisms of how these mushrooms work. We talked a little bit about ergothioneine, talked a little bit about different mushrooms and their applications. And now we're just talking about bitters and how mushrooms are a good way, and definitely all those different herbs that Lee just mentioned are a great way to get those into your diet. Anything else you want to talk about, Lee? I'd like to leave this last little bit just a sort of open slate. I know I've been kind of guiding you with some harder kind of questions, but you've been great to pull up your own stuff. But anything else you want to share about medicinal mushrooms, why they're so top of mind for you right now in terms of clinicians or the general public?
Yeah, we have covered a lot of ground, and I've talked about the important things that I wanted to raise, but I think from a more spiritual kind of global interconnectedness, I think that, that there's a lot more consciousness now around mushrooms and the good work that they do in the environment, and they keep, our ecosystems stable, and they really interconnect everything. There's been a significant and very positive upswing in the acceptance of mushrooms as psychedelics and the benefits that they can play, not just in mental health issues, but also in terms of human creativity and human betterment, improved relationships within families and that sort of thing. That really interests me at the moment. I'm experimenting with microdosing with psilocybin. I'm doing 200 milligrams 5 days a week, and it's making me more resilient, making me more creative. It's making me, more wholesome, as a human. So I think that the concept of mushrooms and their ability to interconnect every aspect of life, on planet Earth, and improve not just the physical, but the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, really is a very timely wake-up call for modern humans, to take what mushrooms have got to offer more seriously, and not just see them as the gift of health, but to also see them as the gift of knowledge, and, honor them and, cherish them as, incredibly valuable teachers that we should be respecting, and not fearing or cowering from. So I hope it's okay for me to mention that sort of thing on the channel. But in Australia, that sort of medicine's currently illegal. So you're lucky in the US and in North America where, the regulations are a little bit more open.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big part of the conversation, I think, just with, like you said, the interconnectedness of, yeah, not only the use of them in health, but in the environment with remediation, like you said, but
Yeah.
also in different domains of health, like you said, like mental health, spiritual health, oncology, these end of life sort of things, which is so interesting because they're the web of the nature, the natural world, and they're that sort of connection piece for everything with the mycorrhizae, and then also they're decomposing things, so they're sort of connected with this whole rebirth of taking something old, creating the new. So yeah, there's lots of different studies going on right now in the States with psilocybin and other psychedelic. It's definitely an emerging frontier, and I hope we don't lose that whole tradition and that reverence for what we're using within it all. But I'm glad that you're getting more creative with your microdosing and your use of psilocybin. What have you been creating?
My problem is, not creating, my problem is excessive creation. I've been able to fine tune it under the influence of the psilocybin, and a big thing that I've been working on lately, obviously, is this course that I've been writing, and developing concepts around how to use mushrooms, throughout, a well-established Western herbal medicine or a modern, naturopathic clinic. You mentioned that in the introduction. Hopefully, I'm going to have it available August or September. But I've been working really hard on developing material that allows a healthcare professional, hopefully a naturopath and a herbalist, but chiropractors and medical doctors and pharmacists, anybody that is interested, giving them the full scope on how mushrooms fit into a modern clinical practice and how to use them sensibly and backing up with science, and then allowing my creative brain to then run on and develop the recommendations that would guide practitioners in how to treat their patients. So I got taught that we're called practitioners because we practice on the patient, and the patient's called the patient because they have to be patient while we wait to work out what's wrong with them. I don't work in this paradigm of having set protocols that I would give a patient. So writing this mushroom course and developing the content and feeding it back through the clinics, the patients that I see in clinic, has allowed me to develop a big menu of options that could guide the practitioner in all of the different health categories. So in this health category, these are all of the underpinning reasons as to why this person has this disease. Here's all the risk factors. Here's all the metabolic stuff. Here's all of the physiology stuff. Here's the traditional approaches to doing it. Here's how mushrooms fit in. I recommend you start here with these things, but it's up to you to fine tune it. So here's some additional options that you might want to add. So the microdosing has really given me a lot more clarity on being able to plumb those depths across, all of the different body systems and the different sort of patient types.
Great. Well, I'm glad that that's been a good support for you. And what's the name of your new course?
Yeah.
What's the name of it going to be?
It's a mouthful. It's going to be called Integrating Medicinal Mushrooms into Clinical Practice.
Great. Yeah. We'll link that in the show notes and definitely show that to all the readers and the listeners. Okay, great. Well, this was awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to myself and on the Real Mushrooms Masons Medicinals podcast. So thank you, Lee. Really appreciate
My pleasure. Yeah, awesome. I've enjoyed it, Mason. Thanks very much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.